possibly happened and also to prevent its spread. What of the nursing staff themselves who are right on the front lines? What happens with testing and monitoring what their risks and exposure?
Yeah, well, I don't think that there is a comprehensive screening program in place for nurses that are frontline especially. So there needs to be, similarly to what we're seeing in the ports, a strategy to ensure that all the frontline workers, all the nursing staff, all the doctors, all the laboratory staff are themselves put through a screening program.
So is some testing happening, but it's not in any way systematised?
That's right. It's not a coordinated nationally approach. Some of the providers will ensure that their staff are screened. Some of the DHBs will run that screening program, but it's not a standard strategy or strategic approach to it.
Given the urgency of the last week and what it has exposed around testing, say, of the isolation staff, is now the time to implement a systematised process for nurses?
Definitely the time is right.
Any indication that's going to happen?
I think that's one of the conversations that our organisation will be having with the Office of the Chief Nurse and the Director General. It is certainly, we cannot forget the carers on the front line and ensuring that they are well screened and that there is a standard process in place for those. We can't just go out screening members of the public or specific workplaces unless we're confident that we've got a screening process available for frontline workers.
Since the outbreak of the pandemic, generally we've seen pressure points in aged care. We went through a period of time where the real focus was on people returning in the border and isolation facilities. Now we have a community outbreak that is particularly affecting the Pacific community. What are your concerns and interests there about how best to support efforts to manage and contain this outbreak?
We do have to follow the Ministry of Health guidelines. We need to make sure that we are proactively and encouraging members of the public to ensure that they wash and dry their hands after each contact, that they need to ensure their social distancing when they're out in public, to wear masks, especially to protect yourself from the contact or the vulnerable people. I think this is not just a time to be kind, but it's actually more important to be calm, and that everybody is in this waka together. Everybody needs to support one another. And what we've seen recently through the social media and the negative flack that outbreaks or clusters or communities had on the Auckland situation, those efforts do not support a cohesive team to get through this together. So more importantly, we need to understand how do we support each other through these really challenging times. We have people that are really scared. They were scared in the first wave. They're even more so now because the community transmission is real. So now more than ever, we need to be really calm in the way that we approach for any screening. We need to be calm in the way that we respond to any of these outbreaks, and just think through our next steps. Remember, these are somebody else's mother, brother, sister, or daughter, and we need to be really calm and supportive through this time, but ensure that we are caution, and we do our own protective best sort of prevention that we can do in this time.
Kia ora,
it's really difficult.
Yeah. Thank you. Kiri Nuku of the Nurses Organisation. 10 to 10 it is on 9 to noon. Well, let's head away to Europe now before heading back to the Beehive around 10 for the announcement on the election. Let's go to Lyon, where I'm not sure, Seamus Kearney, if you're a football fan, but if you are, you've probably been up celebrating for the last few hours non-stop.
Catherine, good morning. I've been here in Europe for 26 years now, since leaving New Zealand, and I can tell you that I Never really took to football, but I tell you what, you just have to be a fan at the moment in Lyon. Last night, the horns were going, they were letting off fireworks in the city. And of course, Olympique Lyonnais is the big team here. They were really seen as the underdogs in the Champions League, but they just performed this stunning upset, beating Manchester City 3-1 victory. That was on Saturday in Lisbon. And I can tell you a lot of the fans out here celebrating overnight here in Lyon really wished they'd been there in Lisbon. Because of COVID-19, they had restrictions on those who could go into the stadium. But a huge celebration here, going into the semi-finals of the Champions League, as I say, and they're going to face Bayern Munich. And this is the first time in almost 30 years, I'm told, that there's no team from England, Spain, or Italy in that last four of this huge contest here in Europe. I'm going to have to learn a lot more about that in the days and weeks to come, I think.
Wow. Well, there we go. Good to see a town celebrating at the moment. Now, extraordinary scenes in Belarus. Just to remind us, ahead of this election, we'd seen the opposition contestants sort of disappear and leave. Just remind us what's happening around this election and now the protests that are the result.
Yes, huge amounts of people out on the streets for a totally different reason. This is Belarus, the former Soviet nation. This is the president, Alexander Lukashenko. Now, he's been given the nickname for years now as Europe's last dictator. He's been in power for 26 years. If he stays in office after those disputed elections last weekend, this would be his sixth term, so 65 years old. A lot of people are now really this weekend talking about the rise and the fall of Alexander Lukashenko. What we've had this weekend, a massive demonstration, an estimated 200,000 people turning out today for this demonstration in the capital there, calling on Lukashenko to resign, to make way for new elections, to release political prisoners. A lot of people saying this is the biggest protest yet against the rule of Lukashenko. We have had protests in the past. Every time he came up for election, every 4 years, I remember covering demonstrations that took place about 8 years ago, and a lot of the rival candidates were arrested. We had EU sanctions, US sanctions coming into place. He just seems to have this grip on power, supported by Russia, it has to be pointed out. And this weekend, we know that Lukashenko actually has been in contact twice with President Putin. The latest media reports we're hearing is that Moscow has promised to offer military assistance to Lukashenko if that's required. Perhaps that could be a sign of things possibly escalating further. But we've had a lot of images coming out of Belarus tonight. A lot of people, scores of people arrested, complaining of being beaten, humiliated in custody, some even talking about torture. And as I say, these elections we had last weekend, a lot of people are just saying these were absolutely rigged. Lukashenko claiming to have won by more than 80% of the vote. And he's dismissing this protest movement as foreign interference. And that line also being echoed by Moscow as well.
What is the sense of possibilities for the next days? What are people talking about could happen?
Well, it's funny. I was talking to a Belarusian journalist who is actually in exile from Belarus, living here in France, and he was saying this really is a turning point. Never has he seen so many people out on the streets and so bold and so publicly denouncing the president. In years gone by, we have seen these protests, but those people have been quickly rounded up, taken into custody, or people have gone into exile. So to have really so many people publicly attending these demonstrations, these rallies that have been taking place over the past week. For this journalist that I spoke to, he says it really is a turning point. He's saying that really the big thing now to watch is how is President Putin going to react to this? Is he going to offer that support, or is he going to use this to perhaps have a change of guard in Belarus? For President Putin, Belarus is really seen as part of a buffer zone to NATO. Don't forget, we also have Russian gas that's exported through Belarus to the west, so very strategically important for Putin. But he won't want to have this kind of trouble on his doorstep. We've seen revolutions in the past in former Soviet states. And really, there is this sense that Lukashenko really has turned to so many people in the past. He's turned to Russia often. But then in the last 5 or 10 years, I can recall covering stories where he has made approaches to the European Union, to the International Monetary Fund, to the European Development Bank. He's never really got funding or help from those organizations because there's just not the kind of democratic reform or economic reform. And there have been continuing reports over the past couple of years of this tension between President and Lukashenko. They're not getting on. There apparently had been some kind of push by Putin for closer cooperation on defense, setting up some kind of union or some kind of alliance. And Lukashenko pushed back on that. But now with these demonstrations we're seeing, Lukashenko, as I say, this weekend, those 2 phone calls to Putin. And really now what's going to happen, I think it really is going to be up to Putin. Is he going to offer a corridor out of Belarus for Lukashenko, 65 years old, 6 terms in office? Will he try to open up a new administration, perhaps somebody to replace Lukashenko?
In the meantime, Britons are rushing to get home from their European holidays to meet a deadline, or they're what, going to face quarantine?
And I was going to say, Catherine, we've been covering so much the headlines also from New Zealand, just stunning to see the developments there. But, I think everywhere we're seeing this surge now. And as you say, yes, we've had some travel chaos in Europe this weekend, lots of Brits racing to get home. This was after London announced that anybody coming from France is going to have to go into a 2-week quarantine. And this is because France is actually seeing a surge in infections and cases. Just today, the figures I saw there, it's the 2nd day in a row we've had new infections above the 3,000 mark. Just looking at some other countries as well, Italy, a new surge in cases. They've now brought in testing at borders. They're going to have people having to have tests if they come from Spain, Croatia, Malta, Greece. Also, Italy bringing in the wearing of masks in public from 6 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. All nightclubs closed. On a personal level, I'm supposed to be driving to Italy tomorrow. I'm really going to have to look online to see if that's going to be possible. Spain also, it's closed its nightclubs, and there's going to be early closing of bars and restaurants. And Madrid is also bringing in random testing of the population. But this situation we had between Britain and France, it could get worse because we now have France saying it's actually going to bring in reciprocal measures for Brits wanting to come into France. This is a real blow to those who were hoping that this was going to be some kind of catch-up, if you like, for the airline industry, for the tourism industry, but we're going to have lots of cancellations of flights now. And this announcement we had, it was just crazy. It was 3 o'clock in the morning this morning that people were told these new measures are going to come into force. Anybody going from France to Britain, we're going to have to go into quarantine. So we had a lot of people, they just had 24 hours to cut short their holidays to make this decision to find ways to get home. We had a lot of demand for sea, air and train travel pushed right to the limits. We had reports of private jets, for example, hired by those really desperate to get home, extra ferry crossings organised to cope with this as well. And don't forget, France is the second most popular holiday destination for Brits. So an estimated 160,000 Brits chose to come to France for their summer vacation. A lot of those are going to be staying here, perhaps hoping to avoid that quarantine.
Thank you very much. Seamus Kearney speaking to us from victorious Lyon. We're standing by for the Prime Minister's announcement of the election date. We cross now to RNZ News.
Morena, everyone. Today will be a busy day of announcements as we continue to roll out our COVID resurgence plan. This morning, I will be sharing with you details on any impact on election planning. At 1 p.m, there will be the usual update on COVID cases from the Director General of Health. At 3 p.m, the Minister of Finance will give details of the support packages for businesses impacted by the current restrictions as part of our COVID response. Clearly, as a government, our current priority is getting the COVID outbreak under control and removing restrictions on New Zealanders as soon as possible. Our resurgence plan is in full swing. There are high levels of testing, rapid contact tracing, close contacts in self-isolation and cases in quarantine, alongside the level 3 restrictions that are all designed to limit the spread of the current cluster. However, it is clear that the re-emergence of COVID in Auckland at the beginning of the formal campaign period has been cause for concern. I should be clear that the Electoral Commission since April has planned for a range of scenarios, including the possibility of an election period where the country is at alert level 2 and with some areas of the country at alert level 3. There is no suggestion at this point that New Zealand will be in these elevated alert levels during the September election. However, while the Electoral Commission's primary consideration is the delivery of a safe, accessible and credible election, there are other factors that I believe also need to be considered. These include the participation of voters and the ability of the Electoral Commission to reassure them that measures are in place to allow them to participate safely in the election. This includes vulnerable communities who might be reluctant to vote in person, ensuring a fair election with the opportunity for all parties to campaign, and finally certainty, and ultimately the need for an election to be held in a timely way. Ultimately, I want to ensure we have a well-run election that gives all voters the best chance to receive all the information they need about parties and candidates and delivers certainty for the future. With these considerations in mind, yesterday I reached out to the leaders of every political party with representatives in Parliament. Under normal circumstances, the choice of what day the election is held is a decision that solely rests with the Prime Minister. However, under these extraordinary circumstances, I see the decision to move an election day as a different proposition that deserves to be treated as such. Moving an election date, especially this late in the electoral cycle, is a significant decision. In the end, what matters most is what is in the best interests of voters and our democracy. Any decision to review the election date must be as free from partisan political interests as possible. It is fair to say that there are a very broad range of views amongst political parties, and that complete consensus is unlikely. But there were some areas of agreement. The need for certainty was one. In this respect, the calculation around when to hold an election is not an easy one. COVID is continuing to disrupt life around the world. Pushing an election out by several months, for instance, does not lessen the risk of disruption. This will in part be the reason why many countries have held elections while managing COVID, including South Korea, Singapore and Poland. Weighing up each of these issues and the feedback of a broad range of interests, I have sought and received advice from the Electoral Commission on a range of options, including retaining the current date of the 19th of September, moving the election by 4 weeks to the 17th of October, and the final possible date the Electoral Commission considers the election could realistically be held, which is the 21st of November. Having weighed up all these factors and taken wide soundings, I have decided on balance to move the election by 4 weeks to the 17th of October. At the end of last week, I was advised that this date is achievable and presents no greater risk than had we retained the status quo. I've also been advised that in moving to a 17 October election day, the Commission will be able to leverage and draw on much of the work already undertaken to deliver the election. Beginning early voting during school holidays, while having the downside of some people moving around the country, would mean that some additional facilities would become available for the purposes of early voting. The biggest risk to overcome will be ensuring access to the election day workforce, which includes some 25,000 workers. This has been identified as a risk no matter what day is chosen. I did consider the possibility of moving the election by the same period of time that we anticipate Auckland could be in level 3, a period of 2 weeks. I was advised by the Electoral Commission that this would not provide them with enough time to rebook venues, print materials, and reorganise the election workforce. Ultimately, the 17th of October, in approximately 9 weeks' time, provides sufficient time for parties to plan around the range of circumstances we could be campaigning under, for the Electoral Commission to prepare, and for voters to feel assured of a safe, accessible and credible election. Due to this decision, I am proposing that Parliament reconvene tomorrow. The Business Committee will meet this afternoon to agree a timetable for Parliament for the next few weeks, but under the circumstances, I consider it important that Parliament is able to consider the decisions of government and that these decisions are still subject to appropriate scrutiny. The dissolution of Parliament will be scheduled for Sunday the 6th of September and writ day will be Sunday the 13th of September. Nominations will close at noon on Friday the 18th of September. Advance voting will start on Saturday the 3rd of October and the last day for the return of the writ will be Thursday the 12th of November. I have advised the Governor-General of the new election date. My final comment is a simple one. COVID is the world's new normal. Here in New Zealand, we are all working as hard as we can to make sure that our new normal disrupts our lives as little as possible. I know the uncertainty COVID has created is incredibly difficult though, and for everyone. We are all in the same boat. And so I do want to give an assurance that I do not intend to change the election date again. We are all adapting, but adapting also means preparing for all circumstances we may face together. My hope is that this decision allows us to do just that. I'm happy to take your questions.
Minister, don't we run the risk if you have October 17 that we could see another resurgence of COVID-19 and we have to go through the process all over again?
I think that's an important point to make, is that the Electoral Commission have actually prepared for a range of circumstances, including, since April, they have prepared for the holding of an election at level 2 and even with some parts of the country at level 3. Now, there is nothing currently to suggest that New Zealand will be in that position. But I accept that there is a sense of anxiety, including from political parties, around the disruption to the beginning of the formal campaign period. This date, I think, will give certainty. It's a balanced decision, but I do think it's a decision that needs to stick, and the changes from here should not be made again.
How much pressure was on you from Winston Peters to push it out rather than stick to September 19th?
Ultimately, this was my decision. It's one that I believe is balanced. And it is fair to say that the Deputy Prime Minister, even at the beginning of the year, was of the view that that was his preferred election date long before we had these experiences.
Did you feel held to ransom by any political parties in making this decision?
No, I did not. I did canvass widely. I canvassed everyone. Not everyone was of the same view, but I gave equal weight and equal measure to everyone's view.
Feel like you've staved off any potential motion of no confidence in the government?
I personally didn't consider that a threat in the first place. Of course, a no confidence vote would trigger an election.
If it was just your view, would you have preferred to stick with something like
This is my view. The date I've chosen actually is my view.
Only took into account your interest.
Even if I had not picked up the phone and contacted anyone, I believe this is still the outcome I would have arrived at. You know, my view is that in normal circumstances, the Prime Minister has the privilege of choosing the election date. The decision to move the election date is something entirely different. I think it was only right to take soundings from others, and I included in that Business New Zealand and the Council of Trade Unions. But ultimately, I do need to provide certainty, a sense of fairness, and a sense of comfort to voters that this will be a safe election. And I do think a little extra time to assure them of that is important as well.
Prime Minister, ahead of making this decision, did you provide a heads up to any other party leaders this morning about your intention to push the date back 4 weeks?
So I spoke with everyone to canvass their views and to sound them. The only parties that, before coming down to announce the decision, I made aware of the final decision was my coalition partner and my support party.
Why the Green Party take it?
Simply, timing, but simply the fact that I do feel that I do have obligations to those that I form government with to inform them of the decision. It was for their information. There was no sense that I was going to change my views, so I simply informed them of the decision that I'd made.
How did the Green Party take the news?
If there's another outbreak in Auckland in the fortnight beforehand, what happens?
My view is that we are sticking with the date that we have. Obviously, the Electoral Commission have done planning around conducting elections in Level 2 and Level 3 conditions. My hope is as well that although it is unusual to hold advanced voting periods over a school holiday period, my hope is that that will create the opportunity for potentially additional venues, venues that often have much larger capacity. They already were anticipating that roughly 60% of the population would advance vote, and that would enable them to conduct an election in a safe way. The booking of those venues, all of that work though, does sit with the Electoral Commission. I'm not anticipating that at this stage. There is no evidence to suggest that is where we would be.
If it did, would you have to delay again?
It's a hypothetical that I am not, that I see no cause for me to consider. Under the law, once Parliament has dissolved, if the Electoral Commission believes that they physically cannot hold a safe election, then they have the ability to move the election if they feel the need to. That's already set out in law, and it includes in circumstances of a pandemic. Given the planning they've done since April, I see no reason why that would occur, though.
What impact, if any, do you see this having on voter turnout?
That is front of mind, of course, for the Electoral Commission, but also is something that I gave consideration to. What enables us to maximise turnout? And I do think it is making sure that even though there has been plenty of planning by the Electoral Commission for these very circumstances we find ourselves in, I think it is important that we take the time to communicate that well to voters too. I think advanced voting, we're already anticipating a large number of people will use that. I think under these circumstances that may only grow. People will take the time to go on days where they feel like perhaps they can avoid crowds and participate safely. And that's the environment we want to create. I absolutely have confidence that we can and will deliver a safe, credible election. This gives the Electoral Commission a bit of time to talk the public through that as well.
So a lot of MPs are at the moment in Auckland. Just logistically for the next couple of weeks while the city is in lockdown, will they be given a special dispensation to be able to come down to Wellington, or will we just see a significantly peeled back Parliament?
I imagine that we will. I, for instance, am of the view that, at least speaking for the Labour caucus, I do not wish for my Auckland MPs to be coming out of Auckland in order to attend Parliament. It'll be up to different parties as to how they conduct themselves, though, because you'll recall that parliamentary representatives have in the past had dispensation to travel when we have had restrictions in place. But my expectation is that, at least for the Labour Party, they'll stay put, because we can do the job of holding parliamentary sessions without those Auckland MPs.
Did the referendum sway into your decision as well?
No. Similar considerations. It's just essentially making sure that people feel are able to safely participate in voting. Again, keep in mind, my view is where we've landed. I do not believe that 2 weeks worth of restrictions, and there's nothing to suggest it would be otherwise, warrants pushing out the election more than we already have, which is by 4 weeks.
Decision is hugely disruptive to not just the people who work here, but also flow-on effects for businesses and for volunteers and things like that. How much of that weighed into your decision making?
Oh yes, I can assure you, I have thought about every single element of this, and there are many knock-on effects. You know, there'll be candidates who have taken leave without pay in order to campaign and to be a part of the election. There'll be electoral workers, 25,000 of them, who have planned for a specific date. I absolutely understand the magnitude of this decision, but I also understand the magnitude of calling an election at a time where there may be questions raised over whether or not it's fair and safe. I think New Zealand deserves to have both certainty and a balanced decision, which I think this one is.
That letter last night, or making public that letter that Winston Peters wrote to you last night, the sense was that he was so concerned that you were going to go with the September 19th election date that he was sort of putting it out there. Can you rule out at any point Winston Peters forcing your hand?
Absolutely. At no point in any of my discussions did I share a view on what my intent was, because actually my intention was shaped as much by the health information I was receiving and the wide range of other factors. In fact, I think it would be entirely inappropriate for this decision to be based on anything that could be seen as political partisanship. That should not be the weight of where the decision sits. And so it wasn't. I did want to take soundings to take on board all of the views, but at no point did I give any particular weight to any political party. That would not have been the right thing to do.
Yep. You mentioned that if there were a motion of no confidence passed, you said that would immediately trigger an election.
It's one of the things that could be the outcome.
Because isn't it possible that a majority caretaker government could be formed as well, and that would have also...
Yes, and they would need to demonstrate to the Governor-General the confidence. Look, I see these as hypotheticals that were never really a reality, but equally they were not things that also caused me to make my decision either way. You'll have heard me set out all of the factors that I took into account. For me, it would not have been appropriate to make a decision based solely on the views of individual political parties, because an election date is one of those things, when you move it, the last thing you want is it to be seen to favour any political parties. That would be wrong.
Did you give any thought to what has been mooted by the National Party is by forming some sort of super majority and then pushing the election back into 2021?
No, my view is that in these circumstances, in these times, what we need is the ability to make decisions very quickly. We've seen the importance of that in the pandemic response. We have the absolute right and ability to do that as government until polling day and thereafter. After the election, that's when caretaker provisions come in, but not beforehand. And I do think that that's important to remember from a constitutional perspective for New Zealand.
Say this is the last delay, barring maybe a massive level 4 outbreak.
Yeah.
There's no more movement.
I have absolutely no intention at all to change from this point. My view is that this allows all political parties, we are all in the same boat, we are all campaigning in the same environment, to adjust any of our planning that we need to accommodate for whatever environment we find ourselves in. Now, I understand it's disruptive to have begun the formal campaign period, having to make that adjustment, but this gives really a clear run for everyone to understand we are all in the same position and we have to all prepare no matter what.
Logistically, will you have another campaign launch and all of those kinds of bits and pieces, or is that it?
No, we won't launch again. We have. Obviously, what we're having a conversation around now is particularly over the next 2 weeks what we'll do. Rightly, the focus for our Auckland candidates is about making sure everyone's complying with the restrictions, about looking after their communities and their well-being. So I expect our decisions over the next 2 weeks in that region will reflect that. But we're just having that conversation now with our team.
Suspended campaigning at the moment.
No, those will be decisions for individual political parties. It's certainly... Yeah, and so for us, I imagine, obviously in Auckland, our main focus is making sure that we're looking after the well-being of our communities, that we're all complying with the restrictions that exist. And so over the next couple of weeks, that's the focus.
MPs will still be campaigning as well as...
That's actually, I only have just, of course, letting our team know the decision, so we'll work through that together. But our natural instinct, of course, when we moved into these restrictions was to primarily focus on getting Auckland and New Zealand through this period.
Does that mean hoardings across the country all have to be taken down?
No, that's not my understanding, and nor would anyone, I think for this extension that it would be warranted. We're talking an extension of 4 weeks. A huge amount of work and labour goes into putting those up, and I don't think that's a common sense decision.
Have you had any advice though on how this affects spending limits?
Regulated period?
Yeah,
so very early advice, and it's fair to say that we are waiting on a bit more urgent advice from Crown Law. There are a range of options. One, of course, includes simply that the caps exist but just over an extended time frame. But there are some alternate interpretations. So we're waiting on that advice from Crown Law, and we'll make sure that we talk to all political parties about what comes back there.
will you be proactively releasing the official advice from the Electoral Commission and other agencies that have informed your decision around that?
I mean, I've used because some of the early advice indicated that the view that 17 October would be difficult. I then subsequently received advice that actually they saw it as only as problematic as delivering on the 19th of September. So it has been iterative, as you can imagine, some of that advice. But I anticipate that we'll be releasing that as we do all advice that we receive as a government, unless it's commercially sensitive or legally sensitive.
Long term, do you think it's appropriate for the Prime Minister to be making a decision on election day?
Yeah.
Or do you think it should rest with a non-partisan body like the Electoral Commission?
Well, it does. We do have the ability, of course. These are very extraordinary circumstances. Once the Parliament has dissolved and the writ is issued, it does, by law, sit with the Electoral Commission. The issue was that hadn't quite happened yet. Now, it was an option for me simply to allow Parliament to dissolve and for the writ to be issued and for it to then go to the Electoral Commission. And I did consider that because that would have taken any perception out of partisan politics away. But their limitation is that they can move the election week by week. And the advice I received from them that was moving it week by week was quite problematic, that if they were having to move it, they needed a block of really at least 4 weeks to be able to do that successfully. So I felt like even though that might remove the partisan nature of that decision, it wouldn't necessarily lead to a better, more credible, more secure outcome from the Electoral Commission's perspective. So that's why I took the weight of the decision. In terms of whether or not we may want to adjust that in the future, look, worthy of consideration, not something I've thought about now, though.
Globally, are you concerned that globally this might seem like an incongruity, that the country that's had one of the best responses to COVID-19 will now be one of the few to delay its national elections?
So there have been others. There have been others, and of course, some of those that have delayed for the likes of a year. That was never something that we would entertain here. And I think that the fact that we've moved for 4 weeks does demonstrate that we see this as much as a logistical question as we do anything else. We are not proposing to push out for a long period of time. And in fact, we're not even proposing to push out beyond the legal term limits. You'll recall that the election simply had to be held before the 21st of November. So in that sense, it's not an extraordinary move. It's not one that is constitutionally challenging. It does sit within the timeframes of when an election legally needs to be held within New Zealand.
Last week you said testing of border staff had been happening all the way through. That wasn't true. What exactly are you doing?
If you wouldn't mind, we've got an update on border staff testing, MIQ testing and others at the 1 o'clock.
Your statements though, so that wasn't
Yes.
true. What are you doing to make sure that the information coming out of you is accurate?
Well, actually, border testing had been happening. The issue you raised is whether or not it was as comprehensive as it should have been. That is a fair point and one that the Minister of Health has addressed. My absolute expectation is not only will we have a comprehensive picture through this last tranche of testing, but that we have a very comprehensive mandated approach going forward as well.
You said last week.
Knowing that the fear and anxiety is building in Pacifica and Māori communities with this last cluster, do you think this new date is fair to Pacifica and Māori voters?
And I factored that in, and that even though the Electoral Commission since April has been planning for an election to be conducted, for instance, with level 2 restrictions, and so that therefore implies with COVID being managed within our communities and potentially with level 3 in some areas. What I do think we need time for is actually to really assure voters that that planning's been done, that it will be safe, that it will be credible, it will be accessible. And so even though that's been done in reality, I do want the time to assure voters of that, because we don't want a situation where people feel they can't participate.
Last week. You said last week.
I'll just come here to Audrey and then I'll come to you, Derek, after a couple of the back.
Just following on from Jenna's question, do you feel that you were misled about the level of testing going on in quarantine facilities?
Border or quarantine?
Quarantine.
Quarantine, because definitely we have said that it hasn't met our expectations. You will have already heard the Minister of Health say that. We had, as a Cabinet, required regular testing at those facilities, both at the border, very regularly at the jet park as our primary place of quarantine, and regular testing in other facilities, but the most regular being the jet park. And so that was something that Cabinet had instructed. Obviously, we've seen from some of the data that has come out, it did not meet our expectations, and we've already said that we feel that that it has not met our expectations.
Do you believe that it was misled about the level of testing?
Well, I can say, when we ask as a Cabinet for something to happen, we expect it to happen. And so, of course, that has not met our expectations. No one, of course, said to us at any point that it wasn't, that I recall, that what we asked for was not happening. Yeah.
Just on the reconvening of Parliament, given it won't be business as usual, will you be considering perhaps re-establishing the Epidemic Response Committee or something?
No, because remember the Epidemic Response Committee was established when Parliament wasn't sitting at all. In this environment, Parliament will be able to sit. There will be able to be things like question time, ministerial statements and general debate. So I don't see any need for that because we have the usual practices. Last couple of questions. Derek.
You said last week that there was weekly testing at the jet park.
Yes, that was.
So who told you that, and were that's clearly not correct. So who misled you?
I would have to go back and look at who was compiling that information at the time, but as I've set out, Cabinet mandated that. Cabinet set out a decision for weekly testing at the jet park, given that that was the equivalent of a COVID ward. It was essentially where everyone who was symptomatic or had tested positive was moved to. We made a minuted decision that we should have weekly testing at that facility. What it appears, and this again is something that we're still looking into, what it appears was happening is that there was testing on a weekly basis, but at this stage I cannot confirm that every single staff member on a weekly rota was being picked up by that weekly testing. I've got a couple more questions. Do keep in mind we've got 2 more press conferences today where I anticipate we can pick up some of these issues. In the front, and I'll finish with you,
Prime Minister,
Jason.
When you spoke to each of the leaders about their preferred date, what did they say?
I don't want to necessarily speak on their behalf, but it is fair to say that not all agreed with the idea of pushing out. Some, it was contingent on whether or not there was any more certainty if we pushed out than there would be if we stuck with the exact date. My takeaway was that actually everyone was being very considered. You know, they saw that it was not an easy decision, that there weren't really absolutes, but it felt to me like the general view was that a delay of some description was warranted. So I felt like generally that was the view.
Do you anticipate this to be basically a brand new breed of campaigning? I mean, gone are the days of big crowds and walkabouts and streets and flipping more to sort of maybe online social media, or do you anticipate it being basically same old?
In many ways that transition had been happening in modern campaigning. I don't see why there'd be any reason to stop walking down a street. You know, that kind of interaction will, of course, I anticipate continue. But there may be an environment, for instance, if some parts of the country are in level 2, for instance, where you don't have some of those mass rallies of the past. But to be honest, general voters often, you know, aren't necessarily likely to go to mass rallies or to turn out to town hall meetings. For a long time, political parties have been discussing how we access people with very, very busy lives who are using different ways to access information. That includes social media. It still includes things like televised debates and so on. So that's actually been a challenge for us regardless. All right, and Ben, last question.
Do you still believe you'll win the election?
I've never made any assumption about the outcome of the election because, of course, I would never be so presumptuous. We have to work every single day between now and the election to earn the support of voters. Gina, I will give you your last question.
After the Cabinet decision on testing,
yeah,
did you categorically go back and check with the Ministry of Health that it was happening?
We
or
were
was
getting
it an assumption that you made?
I never assume anything. We were getting reports on, as I recall, in our dashboards, I believe, on, again, when we make a Cabinet decision, we have an expectation that testing is occurring. And of course, my expectation would have been that over the testing of patients within MIQ, the first time, around day 3 and day 12, that when Cabinet makes a decision, it is followed up on. I should add, at this stage, although our investigations absolutely continue, there hasn't been a link that's been established between our primary cluster and those facilities, but we are going through and testing everyone who has worked within them and obviously at the border as well.
Were you misled by the Director General?
Oh, no, not. Look, these are all very broad sweeping statements, and I don't think it's fair to make that assumption at all. Our focus at the moment is making sure we get to the bottom of this cluster. We will continue to make sure that we are constantly amping up what is happening in every facility and making sure that when we issue an expectation that it is being met. Okay, thank you everyone.
Look, I think